As you guys might have noticed by now that I'm not there in person, but I'm at home where we're kind of a little bit isolated at the moment because of COVID in the Kriel household. I can assure you that everybody is feeling better. But in the interest of being abundantly cautious at this point in time, we've decided that it would be better for me to speak to you guys from here because, I can't take off my mask and scream at all of you guys if I'm not here. Sorry, that wasn't scream. That's passionately preaching to you guys. But right now I can be as passionate as I like. It's great seeing you guys. It's great seeing the guys in the room, Robert, the Ramirez family, Tammy, Gail, all of you guys. It's fantastic to know that you guys are there live. Thank you to the brave and the strong and the immune and the recovered that are here in person, but also excited for those of you guys that are not in person at the moment, but joining us digitally, as I am, in fact, to bring the word to you guys today. It's great to see some hoopers. Wendy is in Hawaii. I think, Wendy, thanks for sharing that. That makes all of us feel much better now that you've shared that with us on the chat. But it's great to see that, Kathy. It's good to see you, Sherry, Shirley, many others from around the world also that is joining in on the live stream. It is great to be with all of you guys. We're journeying through the book of Jonah. And on this journey, as we're going through the book of Jonah, we started off this book study, and I want to encourage you guys to read with us as we go through this book of Jonah. You'll see that we started last week with this concept of the four cities. So we basically spoke through the four cities in the book of Jonah and kind of just did an overview of his story, but particularly with this theme of reluctance, right? So what does it look like to overcome the reluctance? And if you want to go listen back to that, you'll see that there's four different places you might find yourself. And in each of these four different places, you'd see how you're doing in your journey of reluctance. So how do you overcome the reluctance that you're experiencing in order for you to live in the fullness of what God has for you? We all find ourselves at different stages and different times in our lives, in spaces and in places where we are reluctant. And when we are reluctant, we miss out on what God has for us. And just this week, I had a conversation with Garland that shared her own experience of reluctance with me. And I've asked her to just briefly share it with you. So Garland, if you don't mind just coming forward and sharing that with everybody. Oh, by the way, I was supposed to release the kids. I see they're long gone. I do apologize, Colton, for that. But Garland, would you mind sharing your story with us real quickly?
Certainly. So picture this. I have to have this, by the way, because I get so passionate about what happened to me that I have to keep on track. So forgive me for having a paper in my hand. Picture small town, South Carolina. It's the 70s, I know, long before you all were born. But my husband was in Japan with the Marine Corps for a year. And so I decided to go down and see my mother-in-law in South Carolina. Little bitty church, Wednesday night, Baptist church. You always go to church on Wednesday night, right? There were probably 30 people in the room, maybe. I was sitting there talking to my mother-in-law, and I felt somebody come in and sit down next to me. And it was right here, and I could feel, you know how when you sit close to somebody and the pew's full, they're right there touching you? And I could feel that. And I looked to see who it was, and there was no one there. Service goes on, and as is typical in the Baptist church, altar call comes. Altar call? I kept thinking, because I was a seeker, I was trying to figure out what I really believed. And I kept thinking, do I want to go up? And this voice said to me, go. And I turned as if he were here. And I finally said, after all the musings in my mind, I finally said, no, I'm not going up. 1995, 20-some years later, my daughter had prayed for me for years. I finally come to Christ. I make the decision after seeking, New Age, Judaism, Buddhism, looking at all these various religions, trying to figure out what it is that I believe. And I finally said, okay, Lord, if you are who you say you are, I'm yours. 20-some years later. So I looked back and thought about all the chaos in those 20 years. 2 marriages, 2 divorces. Chaos, drama, all the things that one doesn't want to have to deal with. And yet he redeemed it. Both my children are believers. I have joy. I get emotional. I have joy. I have peace, regardless of what's going on. And he loves me in spite of the fact that I was really lost. And he was there through it all and said, you are my child. I love you. And I'm yours. I'm his. Jurie?
When we neglect to respond to God in the moment, we miss out on the fullness and the greatness that he has for us. And what an incredible God we serve, that we can see God redeeming that. And God, and what a gift you are to us. And I've just been pondering on this incredibleness of God, that he would prompt us at moments in our lives. And if we would respond, imagine what he could do. And I listened to Golin's story, and I was asking myself, where is he prompting me? Now, I might not have a physical presence sit down next to me, prompting me to do something which I don't know where it comes from. But the reality is, there are ways that God's speaking to you, that God's prompting you. And he prompted Jonah, and Jonah's reluctance caused him to miss out on the fullness of what God had in mind for him. So during the series, as we journey through the book of Jonah, we're going to look at chapter 1 today, and there's a missing ingredient in chapter 1. There's something that is missing from the modern day church, and if we discover this one thing in chapter 1, we'll discover what God has in mind for us and how to live in that. So the thing is, Jonah is one of those stories that everybody thinks they know. If you go to the website thetop10s.com, you'll find that of the famous stories in the Bible, the story of Jonah is actually the 4th most famous story, and 2 of them is the birth of Christ and the death of Christ. So it's the crucifixion and the birth of Christ, and then it's only David and Goliath, and then we find number 4, we find the story of Jonah. So it's a very well-known story, but we missed the point. We know the story so well that we sometimes miss these little things in the story that I believe is so critical. We miss this one missing ingredient, and I think the missing ingredient in this story is the idea of reverence, or the idea of the fear of God, which is the one thing that we miss in this journey. We miss the fact that when we read this story, that's one of the points that God's trying to make and get through to us, is that when we don't see God for who he is, we don't worship God for who he is, and we miss out on the fullness of who he is. This is something that I believe the church is missing out on. I think the church as a whole is living outside of the purposes and the intents of God, because they've lost the reverence, they've lost the fear, they've lost the understanding that God is God and we are not. Somebody once said that man has created God in his own image, and I think it's so true. We've made God some politically correct marshmallow that doesn't have any will or any godness left in him, that just does whatever we want whenever we want him. And because we don't see God for who he is, we don't worship God for who he is, and we end up living in this lackluster, watered down, diluted version of Christianity, which isn't what it is. It's supposed to be much more, and Jonah finds himself exactly there. He's going through the motions. He's doing the right things. He's part of the right people. He's actually proud about doing well at that point in time in his journey. But all of his doing well, all of his going through this journey, all of the things that he's doing is actually missing the point. And he's lost his reverence of God, thinking that he could get on a ship and go his own way, seek his own rather than obey God. And I know some of you are at that place today. I know there are people today sitting here in the room or finding themselves watching this online, that is finding themselves in a space where they're exactly there, where they're in that space where they're wondering, that when they're in that space where they're negotiating with whether or not to obey God, negotiating whether or not they will journey with Him, negotiating whether or not they will be obedient to Him. May Jonah chapter 1 speak to you today in your place of negotiation, and may we all come to this understanding, may we discover this missing ingredient today. So Jonah chapter 1 from verse 1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah arose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord sent out a great wind on the sea, and there was a mighty tempest or storm on the sea, and so that the ship was about to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and every man cried out to his God, and threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten the load. But Jonah had gone down into the lowest parts of the ship, had laid down, and was fast asleep. So the captain came to him and said to him, What do you mean, sleeper? Arise, call on your God. Perhaps your God will consider us so that we may not perish. In life, there are different kinds of storms. There's different storms that come about in your life. There's different storms that we experience. There's different hardships, difficulties, and I'm using storms here as a metaphor for those things in life that are tough, right? There's different storms. There's different hardships. There's the ones we bring on ourselves. I'm sure maybe like me, you often bring a storm upon yourself, right? When you just, do the wrong thing or don't do the right thing, you bring on a storm upon yourself. We're pretty good at that, right? We cause them ourselves. There's some storms in your life which you didn't cause, others caused them, and you're in a storm not because of what you did, but because of what someone else did. So the second storm is storms caused by others. The third one are storms that's just caused by the broken world. It's a broken place. This planet is a broken place. People find themselves in spaces of brokenness and spaces of difficulty where they experience brokenness and they experience things happening to them, not because someone was deliberate, just because this world is broken, and it will remain broken until Jesus comes back and fixes it. Sin broke the world, and a broken world, breaks people. And the last type of storms are storms brought on by God. Now, these aren't brought on by other people. They're not brought on by ourselves. They're not brought on by the brokenness of the world. They're simply brought on by God. And Jonah is in such a storm. He's in a storm that has been brought on by God. God had brought the storm against Jonah because Jonah is disobeying God. And right now, Jonah is hiding away from the storm. He's in this deep sleep at the bottom of the boat, ignoring it. I want to pause the story right there and quickly switch over to Mark chapter 4. And in Mark chapter 4, we find this parallel story in the Gospels where they tell the story of Jesus that actually refers back to something very similar. And I want you to have a look at this with me. Okay, so it's Mark chapter 4 from verse 35, and I want you to see this for a second. Okay, so Jesus comes, speaks to his disciples. Verse 35, he says, "Let's go to the other side." Then they get into the boat. They leave the multitude. They go to the other side, and then verse 37, and a great windstorm arose, and there was waves beating into the boat, so that it was already filling. But he was in the stern asleep on a pillow, and they awoke him and said, "Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing?" So do you see the similarity here? Can you see the similarity between what we just read in Jonah and what we read in Mark? So in Jonah, there's someone on a boat crossing over the sea. There's a storm that arises. Both stories there's a storm arising, and both stories there's someone asleep that gets awoken from their sleep, right? So there's a parallel between these stories, and I want to show you how these two stories actually end up with exactly the same point towards the end. So let's head back into Jonah chapter 1, verse 6. So the captain came to him and said to him, "What do you mean, sleeper? Arise, call on your God. Perhaps your God will consider us that we may not perish." And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots so that we might know for whose cause this trouble has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Please tell us, for whose cause is this trouble upon us? What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you?" So he said to them, "I'm a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Now, it's interesting to see how Jonah's kind of catching up to himself a little bit here, because what he's catching up to is he's saying, "I fear the Lord, the God that made the sea and the dry land." Now Tarshish was across the sea, and Nineveh was over dry land from where Jonah found himself. We spoke about this a little last week. But here's the thing. He's starting to realize that he can't run away from God. But not only is he realizing that he can't run away from God, I think he's lying. He says, "I'm a Hebrew. I fear the Lord." No, you don't fear the Lord. You don't fear the Lord if you're going against what the Lord is saying. You don't fear the Lord when the heathens are praying and you're sleeping. That's not what fearing the Lord looks like. That's what hiding away looks like. He says he fears the Lord, but he doesn't. And it's interesting for me, if you look at Jonah's reply here, they say, "Who are you?" And he replies and he says, "I'm a Hebrew." He leads with the idea of being a Hebrew before the fact that he serves God. So he finds more fear, more understanding, more identity in his nationality than what he finds identity in his belief in God. He places his nationality beyond his relief. He has a reluctancy to follow God. He's reluctant to follow God. He's reluctant to pray. He doesn't engage with them in prayer. He places religion, or the fact that he's supposed to do A, B, and C, above relationship with God. And there's a reluctance to pray. There's a reluctance to follow. There's a reluctance to do what God has caused him to do, because here's the principle. Self-made men worships their creator. And they don't know too much about Jonah at this point in time. They don't know exactly what the ins and the outs of his situation was, but we know that he was a person in society of great means. We know that he was a person in society, at least before and then certainly after, of great appreciation and adoration within his own people. And I wonder sometimes how many of us find ourselves in this same place where we don't worship God as much as we worship our version of God. Where we don't worship God as much as we worship our own achievements and our things. Because here's the thing, show me what you fear and I'll show you who you worship. Too often we say that we fear God, but our actions show us that we don't. Too often we say that we adore God, but in actual fact, we adore ourselves more than anything else. Because what we fear is loss of control. What we fear is death on this earth. What we fear is loss of how people see us, loss of reputation. What we fear is financial ruin. What we fear shows us who we truly worship. And I think we fear way too many circumstances. We fear way too many people out there. We're way too fearful of what is going on around us, and we're not fearful enough of God. Even if you look at Jonah's story here, then there's a sense that he's lacking that very thing. He says he's fearing God, but his actions, the very place where he finds himself, says the exact opposite. So the story continues, and I want to put a little note in here that we're gonna stop this story pretty abruptly here. We're gonna stop before the whale. We'll get to the whale next week. We'll get to redemption next week. We'll get to what Garland shared about how God is able to work all things together for the good. We'll get there. But I want to tell you, before Jonah gets there, he finds himself here. And I think we miss being in this spot. I think we miss recognizing what happened at this moment, because he's running away from God. And maybe you're finding yourself in that same space where you're running away from God, where you're building your own empire, where you're living for your own comfort, for your own safety, for your own everything. And you're missing out on the fullness and the greatness and the incredibleness of the purposes of God. And I have such a conviction in my own heart that God wants to challenge us to do great things, but we've got to understand that we cannot worship ourselves and do the great things that God has in mind for us. We cannot continue to live without seeing God for who He is and think we'll live in the plans and the purposes of God. So the story continues, verse 9. It says, "So he said to them, I'm a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were exceedingly afraid, so they said to him, "Why have you done this?" For the men knew that he fled from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. And then they said to him, "What shall we do to you so that the sea might be calm for us?" For the sea was growing more tempestuous. And he said to them, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea, then the sea will become calm for you. For I know that this great tempest is because of me." Now, it's interesting at this point in time because once again, you see this thing that essentially Jonah isn't, there's your Noah, Casey. Jonah isn't fearing God as much as he's fearing the storm. He still isn't going, "Well, I'll repent. Take me back. I need to go to Nineveh. I need to obey God. I need to be a part of what God has in mind." No, none of that. He says, just throw me overboard. I'd rather die than obey God. And, though this sounds a little bit like, wow, he's willing to give up his life so that they are saved. No, that's not what he's saying. If he was fearing God, if he was doing, and you'll see next week how God's heart stays the same throughout. But I want to tell you, as far as Jonah is concerned, he's saying, I'd rather die than do the right thing. I'd rather die than do what God has in mind for us. I'd rather die than go to Nineveh and share the message that God has in mind. I'll rather just you killed me, you'll be fine, and I'll be away from the presence of God. Verse 13, "Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to return to land, but they could not, for the sea continued to grow more tempestuous against them. Therefore, they cried out to the Lord and said, 'We pray, O Lord, please do not let us perish for this man's life, and do not charge us with innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you.' So they picked up Jonah and threw him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging." The other story we read in Mark chapter 4 went down similarly. They wake up Jesus as he was sleeping in the boat. And then when he gets up, Mark chapter 4 verse 39 says, "Then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm." Jesus can supernaturally still the storm in your life. And I don't know what kind of storm you're facing. I don't know if you're in a storm of your own making. I don't know if you are in a storm of others' making. I don't know if you're in a storm of the brokenness of this world. I don't know if you're facing a space where God has caused the storm in your life, because all four of those happen. I don't know what the reason for your storm is, but I know that my God can still every storm. I know that God has the ability to still the storm, to speak to the storm, to change the storm. I know that my God can, but He doesn't always. Sometimes God just gives us the grace to walk over the storm, like Peter and Jesus walking on the water. Sometimes God doesn't still the storm. He enables us to rise above the storm, and yet other times God just gives us the grace to go through the storm. as he did with Paul when he told him to hang on to a plank. This ship was going to sink, but no lives will be lost. Sometimes God doesn't still the storm. He doesn't rise us above the storm. He just allows us to out-survive the storm. But I want to tell you, we serve the God that is bigger than the storm. We serve a God that is greater than the storm, greater than the challenge, greater than the difficulty you're facing. And I want to tell you, are you worshiping the storm? Are you worshiping God? Are you fearing the storm, or are you fearing God? Are you adhering? Are you revering God? Or are you revering something else? The most important part of this entire chapter, in my opinion, is about to follow. Because if you look at the parallel between these two stories, you'll see that the same thing is about to happen in both stories. So when you look at John chapter 1, verse 15 and 16, they picked Jonah up, they threw him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly and offered a sacrifice to the Lord and took vows. These reluctant to believe, the sailors, they were not believers. It wasn't the believers. It wasn't the disciples in this case. It was the sailors, okay? Sailors have particular reputation. I'm nothing in particular against Clyde or anybody else that might have been a sailor, but sailors have reputations, and sailors have, these particular sailors were heathens. If you read of who they worshipped, if you read of what they did, these sailors in the story was praying to other gods. They were reluctant to serve God, but guess what happens? They tried doing it their way. They tried their religion. They tried chants. They tried casting lots. They tried their best, their own works, their rowing. They tried everything, but when it came to this moment, what brought an end to their reluctance to believe in God, what brought an end to it, when they heard who this was that brought on the storm, they didn't pray to God. They just tried harder, rowing harder. They tried all they could to get out of this situation. But what changed them from being reluctant to no longer being reluctant to follow God was when they feared exceedingly. When the fear of God came, when the worship of God came, when the reverence of God came, their reluctance was overcome. Let's look at Mark. So Jonah chapter 1, verse 15 to 16 says, the men feared the Lord exceedingly. Mark chapter 4, verse 39 says this. It says, when Jesus rebuked the wind and said to the sea, peace be still, and the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. But he said to them, why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, who can this be, that even the wind and the sea obey him? They feared God exceedingly. The missing ingredient to overcoming reluctance in your life is to understand who God is. The missing ingredient in the life of Jonah that day was the fear of God. When he made a decision between Tarsus and going to Nineveh, as God has called him, what was missing was the fear of God. What was missing was the worship of God. And I suspect, in fact, I'm convinced that for many of us, that's the missing ingredient. We've forgotten who God is. So we are worshiping a whole lot of things that aren't God. We're worshiping a whole lot of things that simply are man-made things, that are human things, that are things of this world. And we're reluctant to obey God because we've sold out to things that are less than, that are smaller than, and we're rowing and we're taking a chance and we're trying this and we're digging a deeper hole. But if we would just bow our knees and say who God is, explore who he is, embrace who he is, worship him for who he is. There was a day that 3 simple words changed my life. And it was a missionary had come from Egypt to South Africa. Now, if you understand the map of Africa, it's basically from the very top to the very bottom. And he came from Cairo to Cape Town, and he came to be a missionary, and he felt the call of God. It was a Christian man. His name was Samech. You need a little phlegm at the end there to pronounce it correctly, okay? So especially these days with all the allergies going around, some of us are better at this than others, but Samech. Okay, and Samech came all the way from Egypt to Cape Town to be a missionary there. And I met Samech there, and we became friends. And he was there for a couple of weeks, and he was there for about 3 weeks. And 3 weeks into his year-long mission trip, he got sick. He got ill. And they went to the doctors, tried different things. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. He got more and more sick. Eventually, he could barely walk. He could barely get around. He was in a wheelchair, and he was just getting more and more sick day after day. And the doctors didn't know what to do. They tried all kinds of treatments, did all types of tests. Eventually, 3 weeks into this, he came to a point where he said, "I'm going to go back to Egypt." And I remember having a conversation with Samech. I'm like, but you said God called you, and what about the great things that he had in mind? And certainly God can overcome the sickness. Certainly God can heal you. And how can it be that God has called you to this, and now you're sick and you're unable to do what God has called you to do, and you're finding yourself in this position? And how can this possibly be God? How is this possible? How is this happening? And I was complaining with him while he was the one being sick. And Samech looked at me, and he could barely speak at that point in time, and he kind of took a couple of breaths, and I realized he wanted to say something, and I needed to shut up. So I was quiet long enough for Samech to say, "Jurie, sometimes we just need to remember that God is bigger." It's the last I heard of Samech as he got onto that plane. And I don't know why what happened. Was it the brokenness of this world, or storm brought on by some people? But I can tell you this. The only reason God sent him from Cairo to Cape Town was to teach me that we need to remember that no matter what, God is bigger. May we never forget that God is bigger. God is bigger than your storm. God is bigger than your challenge. God is bigger than the difficulty that you're going through. God is bigger. God is greater. And this week, Karen is she was in South Africa for a wedding and spending time with family. And so just as she's about to return, she tests positive for COVID. And thank you guys for praying with me for Karen. I'm not isolating because my wife and we are one and she's on another continent with COVID. That's not it. My son also got COVID, worlds apart. On the same day, they both test positive for COVID. And here we are in a situation where I'm going, by the way, my wife was away for a while, and I have no idea how she does that, how she moms and works and everything else, and she makes it look so easy. She works a full day and then drives the kids around and looks, and she still smiles and loves me on top of all of that. It's incredible. Okay, and I'm struggling just to do all of that, and now my wife is sick and on another continent, unable to travel back. My kid's sick. I'm having to add, mom, dad, breadwinner, nurse. I'm not much good at most of that list. But God is bigger. God is bigger. I don't get it all. He doesn't still every storm. He doesn't come every time I want him to do something. He doesn't do it. He's God. He goes by his ways. And I choose to worship him. I choose to revere him. I choose to say that, God, you are bigger. So Lord, I pray, Lord, that this one revelation, this one understanding will drop into our hearts, every single person that is gathered together in this group, Lord God, or that is at a home listening to the sound of my voice. Lord, I pray that there'll be a conviction. I pray that there'll be a stirring. I pray that something will happen in our spirits today as we hear your word, Lord God. May we have the experience the disciples had on the boats as you spoke to that storm and they said, surely, God is bigger. They were exceedingly afraid, Lord God, as those sailors that tried in their own strength and tried in their own religious activity and tried this. And then they realized and they said, God is bigger. God is greater. God is worthy of my adoration. Lord, may we fear no circumstance. May we fear no person. May we fear no calamity. May we fear no difficulty. May we live with fear and reverence and worship for one and one alone. May we live our entire lives, our entire being, worshiping, loving, fearing you and you alone. Lord, I pray for those that are within the sound of my voice, whether at home somewhere or listening to this message on the way or sitting right here in the room, Lord God. Lord, I pray for those that are finding themselves at a space where they're running away from the purposes of God. Lord, I pray that whatever it is that we're running after, whatever it is that we're running away from, that the fear of God will arise and that we will recognize and proclaim that God is bigger. Psalm 107, verse 23 to 32. Some went off to sea in ships, playing the trade routes of the world. They too observed the Lord's power in action. His impressive works on the deepest seas. He spoke, and the winds rose, stirring up the waves. Their ships were tossed to the heavens and plunged again to the depths of the earth. The sailors cringed in terror. They reeled and staggered like drunkards and were at their wits' end. Lord, help, they cried in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He calmed the storm to a whisper and stilled the waves. What a blessing was that stillness as he brought them safely into harbor. Let them praise the Lord for his great love and for the wonderful things that he has done for them. Let them exalt him publicly before the congregation and before the leaders of the nation.